group a lot, like, hey, does anyone else have one pupil bigger than the other? And I know I had that issue. Like, it wasn't
Mhm.
constant, but every once in a while, one would be noticeably bigger. And people would even say something to me like, what's going on with your
Really?
eyes? Like, one pupil's bigger than the other. And the doctors were just like, yeah. So let's talk about that. Why does that happen?
That's a really good question, and it's one that a lot of people notice, and it's cool because you can look in the mirror and
Yeah.
see like, oh boy, like that's a thing. So people can identify it really well.
It's the
But basically,
physical thing to see.
yeah, we have these simple pathways in our brain that help us to regulate how much light comes in or out. So if you're in like a really bright room, we want to kind of close down that pupil, close down the amount of light that comes in, and that helps us see clearer. We've all been in a scenario where you're inside in like a dark room, maybe like you at the movie theater or like a bowling alley or something like that. And then you walk outside on a sunny day and you kind of takes you a second to kind of regulate that. That's that pupil kind of constricting and being normal. A lot of times, and especially and this can be really helpful in brain injury, because if we actually injure our brain, there's kind of a difference when, like, if something's toxic or a metabolic problem, it tends to affect our whole brain at once, like our whole body at once. When we get injured, sometimes it'll affect one area at a time or like a couple little focal areas. When we see there's a difference in left to right, what that's basically saying is we've got one side, one pathway is working differently than the other side. And that's super helpful in helping us figure out which pathway is going wrong. But it's also really helpful to help us understand. It's kind of like a gas gauge or like an RPM gauge, where like when someone gets more fatigued, the ability to control that system might start to fail and that pupil gets a little bigger. Or if they've been exposed to something that's really hard or they felt overwhelmed by it, you might see that it gets a little harder to control, maybe more sensitive to light. Even sound to a degree will be associated kind of with that larger pupil. So it's a really good window to help us look at as a biomarker, to be able to see kind of which pathways is one side affected more than the other, but then also to be able to use it as a way to measure. Like, one, if we're doing a rehab thing, a lot of people I'm sure do vestibular rehab,
Mhm.
PT, chiropractic care, functional neurology care, all of it is associated with like, what's the right dose? How much is the right amount? Can we just do rehab until the cows come home and you do fine? Or do we do one little thing and you get tired? And a lot of times that pupil is a really good measure of how that's doing. So when it gets bigger, it tends to show us that like the brain's gassed a little bit, versus if they're holding tight and strong, then we're doing pretty well. So it's a really good tool to use. And even in people that have not been treated at all, if you notice, like I got one pupil that's bigger than the other, and sometimes it's better than others, you may be able to use that in your own life as like a little barometer for just how you're doing. Did you go for a drive and all of a sudden that thing's huge? Writing that down and being able to say, okay, well, let's try to see if we can do something to make it smaller again. Um, those are super valuable things, even if you don't have some of the resources that other people do.